Welcome to 3Con Commentaries. This is your host, MagMongoSlade. So the biography on Roddy Piper, phenomenal. It was really good. Now, if you've seen the previous Roddy Piper documentaries and you've listened to him talk about his life before, some of this stuff, of course, is pretty standard. But there is a lot of additions in this one that makes this so much better than the Stone Cold Steve Austin one. For instance, there was a lot of talk from his family. So we got to hear we got to hear from Roddy Piper himself because there's a lot of voiceovers from Roddy, him telling the story from, different documentaries and different other things that he's already done. I think some of this stuff is actually WWE licensed material. So you have him talking about different parts of his life from the WWE documentaries, but there's still some stuff that is fairly new. His children are on here. His wife is on here. And what made this so much better for me is Gene LaBelle is in here. And I thought that was incredibly dope. And of course, Ronda Rousey is in it. And Vince McMahon's in it. He's in it quite a bit, actually. So I really loved this thing. This thing was pretty good. So let's talk about it. So the story starts a little bit dark when, his dad, I believe it said his dad was a police officer in Saskatoon, and they moved around a lot. And he lived on an Indian reservation where he had to fight because he was the only white kid on the Indian reservation. And, Indians didn't really take kindly to him being there. So he kind of would get into fights, and then he would get into trouble with his dad because his dad, was abusive. So he lived a childhood of violence, where he was constantly fighting. And as he grew up, what tends to happen is, it doesn't become so easy to beat up on you anymore. He became a pretty good high school wrestler, and it was a thing where it was him or his dad, so he had to leave. And so he left and started living on the streets. And he basically says he lived in youth hostels. He would steal. He did some robberies. He did all kind of stuff. He started carrying knives. Pretty much became a street urchin, And this is a part of Roddy's story that he talks about, but he kind of always mutters about it, kind of grumbles, where he's not really proud of it. And he kind of like, he tells people about it, but really wants to get through it as much as possible, or as quickly as possible, so people won't ask too many questions. But it's always, I don't know how long he was on the streets, but he was a teenager when he was on the streets, and they say and he was very young because when he was introduced to pro wrestling, he had never watched it before by Father O'Malley. I believe it was a guy who ran a youth hospital. He was only 15, and this is when of course, he met Larry the Axe Hennig, who was his first opponent and beat the tar out of him. And then Larry the Axe Hennig is the one who basically gave him the idea to actually go and travel and be a pro wrestler. So he walked around, he traveled around in the wrestling business for a little while, and then in 1976, he was 21 years old, so that means he had been in the business 7 years already. He ended up in Los Angeles, where he met Judo Gene LaBelle. And Gene LaBelle, when he came to Los Angeles to wrestle, Gene LaBelle thought he was going to be a janitor, or that he was going to be a hot dog vendor because he was so tiny and he was so small. But he said, like, look, I'm trying to be a wrestler here. So Gene LaBelle tried to train him a little bit. I guess this is where he got his first real foray into formal training. And Gene LaBelle talked about training, teaching him how to do things, quote, on the dark side of the moon, where the referee doesn't see it. Eye gouging, grabbing people's throats, and different stuff like that. So this was really good. I really enjoyed this. Ronda Rousey was in it talking about Gene LaBelle, and that was the connection between her and Roddy Piper, is that Gene LaBelle was actually one of her trainers too. He trained her when she did judo and when she did MMA. He was in her corner a lot. So this guy, he's also trained Chuck Norris, and he had also trained with or trained Bruce Lee. So he had a lot of stunt and pro wrestling experience, and this was tremendous stuff. This was tremendous. And then, of course, from here we start talking about his conqueror of the Guerreros situation, where he was feuding with Chavo Guerrero, and he's calling him and his family pigs, playing La Cucaracha as the Mexican national anthem, and that's where the infamous people started tossing chairs in the ring. It was excellent. We get little nuggets of Roddy here and there about him saying, "Hey, look, yeah, be controversial because controversy creates conflict, and conflicts is equals money. Conflict draws money. That's kind of a I'm pretty sure that's where Eric Bischoff probably got his conflict or controversy creates cash concept from. So he was somewhat successful in Los Angeles, but back then it was a territory era. So if he went just a little to the north, he didn't know. Nobody knew who he was. So when he went to Portland, he essentially had to start over. And they didn't talk a lot about his time in Portland, even though I think he was very partial to Portland. Not only because he lived in Oregon until he died, but he also met his wife in Oregon. 1979, he met his wife. We actually find out that Killer Tim Brooks is actually one of the reasons why him and his wife ended up hooking up. At this point, he would think he was 24. His wife was 19, and he was trying to talk to her, trying to flirt with her, or whatever. But she didn't like the crowd that he hanged around with. So she was kind of like, no, I'm not interested. And it was Killer Tim Brooks, who is famously the trainer for a lot of pro wrestlers. One of whom is Keith Lee. He kind of pulled young Kitty to the side and said, look, you got to you got to you got to give this guy your phone number because he's thinking about you so much and we're getting beat up. I guess he kind of kayfabed her a little bit, but that was nice. And they showed I showed a lot of footage from his time in Los Angeles and his time in Portland when he had attacked a female wrestler, and his character was very, very controversial even back then. Like the people think that the Roddy Piper, painted himself half black. It was controversial. Like no, this guy was he played a character that was in quite often was racist or sexist. He would take it to the extremes, which was the beauty of Roddy Piper. Is he didn't seem to care to go to the extremes. He would go there. I really liked they showed some stuff from him his time in Georgia, where they told the story of how he was built up in Georgia, how he started out as a color commentator, and that's really nobody knew he was a wrestler. Obviously, as you go from one territory to another, you essentially start over. And he started out as a color commentator, and then he would over time become a little bit more heelish, and he would start to go heel a little bit on Bullet Bob Armstrong and talk bad about his family and talk bad about him and stuff like that. And then Bullet Bob would lose his temper and beat him up because he's just a color commentator, but he would beat him up, and next thing you know, Roddy is wrestling. Roddy is a wrestler now. Now he's hanging out with Ric Flair, and then he started saying like, okay, Piper is hanging out with Flair, and Flair is a raving alcoholic and partier, and this is really where that sort of thing starts to catch up with Piper. Is that he's hanging out with these guys who are doing coke and drinking all the time, and they're making, of course, they're making a lot of money, but they're doing a lot, and it sounded pretty normal for Flair to be as drunk as he was. And that's what they basically they started turning it up. Of course, this led to the Year of the Year, Greg the Hammer Valentine, this dog collar match from Starrcade, which is pretty fucking good if you've never seen it before. Starrcade '83, the first ever Starrcade. This match was pretty good for that show. So at this point we're in the 1980s. So then after his success in Georgia, of course, he got the call to go to New York City, where Vince thought he was a little too small as well, so he made him a talk show host, and this was, of course, the creation of Piper's Pit. And then, Hulk Hogan makes an appearance here. This is where Hulk Hogan started making his multiple appearances. And he starts talking about, hey, Piper is the kind of guy who could build you up or he could tear you down, depending on whatever he wanted to do at the time. And, Vince talked about the infamous coconut segment, about how they gimmicked a couple of the coconuts, and the one coconut that they didn't gimmick is the one Piper used to hit Snuka with. They didn't go into any detail about this, but there are documentaries out there where Snuka got to tell his side of the story. They kind of chose to avoid Snuka this time, which probably for good reasons. You really don't want people to go too far into the whole Snuka situation. Then, of course, they talked about Cyndi Lauper, which ended up being huge for his career. The gold record situation where he hit Captain Lou Albano in the head with the gold record and kicked Cyndi Lauper, which I would have loved for them to go into a little bit more detail about this, and maybe even to get Cyndi Lauper involved. But this was still pretty fucking good. The whole rock and wrestling situation was awesome. You know, I was just being born at the time, but having gone back and looked at a lot of this stuff, it was tremendous. They talked about the war to settle the score. Of course, Piper and his intense dislike of Mr. T. Hogan talked a lot about this too, about how, you know, these two guys, basically Piper and Paul Orndorff, hated the idea of Mr. T working in the main event or even, you know, doing things with them because he wasn't a legitimate pro wrestler. He had not earned his spot. There was also other people who had a problem with Mr. T that actually did get fired. This would be our good buddy, Dr. D. David Schultz, who I know a lot of people have said, oh, Dr. D. David Schultz, he got fired for smacking John Stossel. It's like, no, Dr. D. David Schultz got fired for his attempts to, let's say, bully Mr. T, which was after he smacked John Stossel. But Dr. D. David Schultz was not mentioned here, obviously. So it wasn't just Piper and Orndorff. There were other people who had problems with Mr. T being there. But Mr. T was in the documentary. He talked about, you know, he understood that this was his opportunity to, or this was the wrestling business opportunity to broaden its scope. That, you know, more people were going to watch it because he was involved in it. And, you know, of course, Piper was willing to give him little things here and there that would get into the newspaper, like him picking him up in a fireman's carry. Like, okay, I'll let you get away with that. But ultimately, you know, whatever it is he can do, keep him down. And Piper refused to do the job. And he said Paul Orndorff also refused to do the job. You know, this was Hogan talking, so who knows how much of it is true. But we do know that Piper refused to do jobs a lot. And that was a huge hindrance for his career, is that he refused to put anybody over. You know, the guys in the 80s and that don't work for me, brother. Oh, man, that was amazing stuff. You talk about character protection. They used to protect the shit out of themselves. So they had, you know, Hogan basically was kind of like, yeah, they had to do this whole thing with Bob Orton in the cast, hitting Orndorff in the back of the head. And it had to be me to pin Orndorff. It couldn't be Mr. T, even though Hogan was like, oh, it should have been Mr. T pinning Piper in the middle of the ring. And I was like, I cringed at the thought of that. Like, I know, you know, that's kind of how they do it now. But back in 1985, this was, oh, God. I probably would have killed Piper's heat. That definitely wouldn't have worked. But Piper did give Mr. T the photo op by him picking him up in the fireman's carry. But after they do all this, and Vince basically was like, look, we couldn't have done WrestleMania without Piper. And I'm glad he said this, you know. I know sometimes they get into this three-way argument between Hogan, who was the top babyface, and saying, like, look, I was selling all the merchandise. You couldn't have done WrestleMania without me. Piper was like, well, I'm the top heel. I had the most heat. You couldn't have done WrestleMania without me. And Vince McMahon was like, look, I was the money. I just want to put my house on the line. You know, I came up with the concept. You couldn't have done WrestleMania without me. But it's kind of like a perfect storm when you need all three of them, you know, in order for it to work. And you had Hogan, but you needed somebody for Hogan to fight. And Piper was perfect. And if you had Piper, you need somebody for him to fight. And in a sense way, Hogan was perfect. And you needed somebody who was willing to put the dressing on the plate. To make it big, to not just make it a wrestling match, but to make it an event. And that's what Vince McMahon did perfectly. And I think that's what made WrestleMania 1 work. I don't think you just take one person and say, well, without this one person, WrestleMania wouldn't have worked. I think that's a huge mistake. But I do love that, you know, they finally have decided to give Roddy Piper some credit, because there was a long time where they didn't really give Roddy any credit. It was basically just like, oh, Hogan and Vince, they did all these great things together. And it's like, well, you know, because they did so much stuff afterwards that, you know, it's kind of like Piper was a small part of the Hogan story, if you believe it or not. You know, yeah, he took Hogan to the next level, but Hogan was on top for 10 years. You know, Piper was, you know, one of his first real feuds. But because Piper was so protective of himself and his character, they really couldn't do too much in the way of business outside of, the war settled the score, which ended in ended in no finish, and then WrestleMania, which ended with Paul Orndorff getting pinned, but it was because of Bob Orton, and then they started going spinning out doing all that crap, right? So Hogan was like, oh yeah, we could have made so much more money, and you probably could have been world champion if you let me beat you, and I'm pretty sure that's bullshit, right? So there's no reason to believe that, and Roddy Piper was smart to not believe it, even though I believe in his later years he probably did buy into Hogan's shit, but that was a bad idea. He never should have done it. He was right to not do jobs. He was right to not do jobs. So obviously they talked about his preparations for life after wrestling. They talked about They Live, so John Carpenter was in it, and basically they said that Roddy Piper kept a legal pad full of his best lines. That a lot of the lines that he came up with, had written them down in a legal pad, and basically he would remember them for times where he was going to do a promo, and the bubblegum line from They Live was in his legal pad, and John Carpenter kind of picked it out specifically for him, which is probably why it's so memorable. But Roddy Piper didn't really like Hollywood. His daughter, I think Ariel, starts telling this story about how she was taken on a trip to Hollywood, and and this trip to Hollywood it somehow ended up in Compton, where Roddy Piper was talking about living on the streets in L.A. back when he was wrestling there, and him seeing people get killed or people dying in the streets doing drugs and stuff, and him not being a snitch, and that Hollywood wasn't really his thing because only wrestlers can understand wrestlers. And I thought that was pretty cool too, and it's actually a very true statement. Then they talked about him being, his return to wrestling in 1989, his situation with Morton Downey Jr., his relationship with Vince is discussed quite a bit in here, not to the extent that it should have been. I definitely think they should have discussed it a little bit more, but this whole documentary started with Vince McMahon doing a skit where he's on the phone, and it's like he's talking to Roddy Piper, and Piper's in hell, and he's kind of like, I got a spot waiting for you. And he's like, you waiting for me down there? It is. It was kind of funny, but it was kind of dark at the same time. But I thoroughly enjoyed it. I liked that, they also talked about the HBO thing in 2003, where Piper was basically had blamed wrestling promoters for all of his friends dying, and that all of his, all of the guys who started having heart attacks and started having drug overdoses, that basically he blamed the wrestling promoters for that. And Vince McMahon being pretty much the only guy still left. And Piper was still under contract when he did this HBO documentary, HBO piece, but I believe it was recorded before he came back to the WWF. So, if I remember correctly, the HBO thing when Roddy Piper went in there talking about how, wrestling promoters, they wear you down and they throw you away up like a piece of meat and all that kind of stuff. And he had recorded that, I think, a year before he had came back to the WWF. But when it was released, he was under contract. And Vince, of course, then sees this and sees that Piper is trash talking him in the company and all that kind of stuff. And he got rid of him. And that was sad. I remember that being a particularly sad time because I was just coming back into wrestling at the time. And I had seen that, when Piper was doing that, the HBO thing. And I was just kind of like, And then I hear that he had gotten fired. I was like, oh, so, Vince is actually proving the guy's point. So he's proving his point. But I get why Vince did it. It was, but he wasn't gone very long. He was only gone for 2 years. He got fired in 2003. He was doing the Sean O'Hare thing. Then he was brought back for the Hall of Fame, and he pretty much stayed under the umbrella for the rest of his life for the most part, even though he did some outside ventures, podcasts, he did comedy and stuff like that. But he never was really on the outs again after 2003, after he got fired. But they talked a lot about his injuries. They didn't talk at all about his time in WCW. I guess it just wasn't important enough. But they talked about his injuries. Most importantly, they talked about him getting stabbed, which sounds frightening. They said Roddy Piper was stabbed 3 times, and the leather vest that he started to wear was stab proof. It had like some type of lining in it that would prevent him from being stabbed, because he hadn't gotten stabbed 2 or 3 times in different territories for how much heat that he would have. And He says that, hey, it was difficult for his family because, he had to move his family out into the country because, he would have so much heat. People would try to fight his kids. He couldn't bring his kids to the shows because it was dangerous. It was dangerous. So I think that there's a tremendous amount of there's something people need to understand. It's like, yeah, it's cool to hear stories about guys getting, having so much heat. People were throwing bricks at them or pulling knives on them. But when you talk to a lot of the older guys today about the kind of heat that they have, they will also be so frightened at it. They would be so scared. Like, we didn't know what to do. Like, yeah, it was pandemonium and there was a little bit of fun because there was money being made. But at the same time, people are trying to kill you, and it's not fun when, you can't relax. You can't go to the bar and have a drink. People don't know it's not real. At least most people don't know it's not real. So, and then the people who think it's not real, they're trying to test you. So I like that. Talked about, how his son, I think Colt, talked about how, hey, I had to get into fights as, because kids trying to test their moxie against me, the son of Roddy Piper and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, this stuff isn't bananas, but it's believable because it's similar stories from wrestlers' kids all the time. Is, you don't see your dad a lot. When you do see him, you try to spend a lot of time with him as possible. And then, you have to deal with the heat that comes with him being a wrestler. People trying to hurt him, and then people stalking you, people stalking the family. So you are incredibly isolated, even from your own father, because of how much time apart you guys have. And then when you are together, there's a lot of paranoia that he might get recognized somewhere, and who knows what might happen. There is another documentary, the Vampiro documentary that I did, where it's the opposite. Like Vampiro, he was never getting attacked because he was such a huge baby face in Mexico. He couldn't go anywhere without people asking for autographs, and he would be like real miserable about it. But back in the days, there was people trying to kill these guys. You think maybe the Mexicans had the right idea about wearing masks everywhere. you know, you kind of they had the right idea. But this documentary was phenomenal. It was a nice pastiche of old footage from LA and Portland and Georgia Championship Wrestling. The historian was Keith Greenberg in this one. So he's really good. It's not very knowledgeable. And we had a lot of mixture of players, some of which had, wrinkles on their face. So they had been around for a long time, Vince and Gene LaBelle and, some people like that. And this was very good. This was excellent. Mwah. Next week is Macho Man Randy Savage. I expect that one to be very good too. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel. Subscribe also via Subscribe Star, which is $5 a month, or you can send cash via the Cash App. Use the hashtag 3Con commentaries to keep track of what I am up to. And I thank you guys for your time, and I'll talk to you guys later, man. Peace out.